So in the first video, we addressed the 4 protocols at a thing we called sociolytics. The theme there was members of society hold differing views on cause and effect for current events based on protocol. The vast majority in our society, and including all of our institutions, remain firmly with the fishbowl at Protocol 1. This brought us to our second video, a fish story in the fishbowl. Analysts deploy the sociolytics, a quirky play of sound analytic practice for the purpose of maintaining our fishbowl etiquette at the expense of avoiding objective truth. In this video, we will look more specifically at the COVID experience to analyze the distinction between the gleeful Protocol 1 perspective and those wacky Protocol 4 conspiracy theorists. As the stakes are high, the discussion is thought to be important, so for the moral majority, Protocol 1 is the only flavor available. In fact, today, our Protocol 1 institutions, like our religion, will actually reach out to police against any thinking beyond the bubble. It would seem your mind has been a precious commodity in the struggle to preserve right think. For me personally, given what we've been taught in school, the narratives under all 4 of the protocols are rather silly, and yet the 4 choices represent the compendium of considerations. Protocol 4 is the least silly of the options, while Protocol 1, on its face, is completely silly. But to go beyond Protocol 1, you have to be willing to say the majority and all of its institutions fortify their perspective are wrong. Protocol 4 enables us to address the key questions. If there is a grand wizard manipulating from above, who might this be? And what are their intentions? So it's off to see the wizard. Let's fly into the eye of the hurricane to compare protocols 1 and 4 for COVID-19. In this video, we're going to look at Part 1, the Protocol 1 perspective. We'll run through the official narrative that is in the minds of the majority and is trumpeted by all of our official institutions, and we'll characterize the points significant to maintaining their mainstream perspective. Part 2, to engineer or not to engineer. Here we will address the hallmarks of the wizard's grand design versus the notion that COVID is a product of nature, to see which path offers the more likely explanation. Part 3, the Protocol 4 position. Here we will leap to the other end of the protocol spectrum to view the world addressed in Part 1, but through the larger lens of prospective conspiracy, suggesting there is a wizard and they have a purpose for COVID-19. Part 4, engineering a global transformation. Here we will look at the wizard's procedure for conceptualizing, planning, implementing, and rolling out grand design to transition global society to a new form of governance, to see whether this resonates with today's reality. Part 5, the conclusion. Here we will raise the key considerations in selecting between the opposing perspectives. Is COVID from nature or part of a grand design? Who is the wizard and what do they want exactly? Part 1, the Protocol 1 perspective. This addresses the prevalent mainstream perspective of society as endorsed and promoted by all of society's mainstream institutions. Here we will address an inside the fishbowl COVID perspective, the key milestones to date in the solution evolution, the tactical measures for the health or for something else, an inside the fishbowl COVID perspective. So here are my friends Freddie and Bartholomew. Fish pretty much spend their days staring within the fishbowl, quite unaware of any potential externalities. Head down, they have no ability or inclination to peer above the waterline and pretty much just take in what they are fed. By extension, the fishbowl institutions, from the governments to mainstream media to academia, are also products of the head-down posture through over a century of their tradition. A key feature in Protocol 1 is, de facto, there can be no larger conspiracy. Unfolding events are WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. They must be a string of natural, one-off, random happenings. There should be no patterns of coincidental benefit accruing to larger authorities, no alignment with pre-existing grand plans of a wizard, no repeating actions that will fulfill the wizard's fantasy. No extraneous factors can be operating to shape your destiny at Protocol 1. Per the last video, this is consistent with that same moral majority's perspective in previous earth-shattering events where Oswald killed Kennedy, Vietnam attacked the US, 19 hijackers attacked the Trade Center, ISIS was attacking our society, humans are killing our planet, and COVID is simply the next random catastrophe. Only for this one, time is of the essence. No time to think. We need to resolve this quickly if we ever hope to return to normal. The key milestones in COVID evolution. Although coronaviruses have been around for at least as long as we've been documenting coronavirus history, over a century, this particular virus is somehow more virulent than your average garden variety facsimiles of the past. Our COVID troubles became publicly apparent early in 2020. Politically, COVID is coronavirus disease 2019, and scientifically it is SARS-CoV-2. Until this arrived, apart from the toxic Greta Thunberg type climate change rantings, the one that conditions us to think the center should be at greater control of our industry and our economy, I thought our fish were getting along swimmingly. Then suddenly the Imperial College of London unleashed its statistical projections for COVID, for consumption by societies around the world. The projections that were since computationally discredited, but hey, then the cat was out of the bag at that point. Our elected leaders of all stripes jumped into action. They were quick to suspend their own judgment, to follow the expert, those voices of science. Chief voices of science were the center's Dr. Tedros out of the WHO, the center's Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, and eventually other voices of science from around the world jumped on the bandwagon to follow suit. Their friend and colleague, the philanthropist with expanding wealth, I might add, Bill Gates, was pressed into service to assist in messaging and then to promote vaccine sales, for which financially he was already vested. Given that there was no time to let this freak of nature, I'm referring here to the virus, gain the upper hand, it was deemed essential that our civil liberties be curtailed and that we provide extraordinary powers to the governments as temporary posture toward flattening the curve. With the developing slipstream of allegiance to the cause, players in the medical industry, the policing industry, and the legal industry became caught up in the vortex, were drafted into submission. A clear public majority trusted the message and jumped on the bandwagon, following the institutions and displaying overwhelming support across the board. People voluntarily closed small businesses, isolated themselves from each other, and contact traced. Though curiously, there was never a specification for them. Masks symbolized our Pledge of Allegiance, our subservience to the cause, and the basis for segregating the I'm a believer crowd from those not buying in. Of course, as we all know, civil liberties once lost are not easily won back. Protocol oneers, while remaining fixated on activities below the waterline, today grow quite frustrated as the light at the end of the tunnel leads to another light at the end of another tunnel. Though there's a prohibition on speaking critically of the program and its measures, the death rate from the COVID measures may be exceeding the death rate from any virus at this point. More and more fish are slowly starting to peak above the waterline. In parallel, central institutions such as the Center for Disease Control, that were the coordinating voice for sounding the alarm last year, have been lately slow-dripping greater context, analyzing more objectively on what is and what is not going on, as if to, now that the public is buying it, return themselves to a position of analytic integrity. Relegated to a relatively minor consideration, the financial implications of the measures are now amassing a huge debt, which, as a positive reinforcing loop, furthers the masses' dependency on the very authorities that were at the center of the call to action. Terminology has evolved as if to maintain the alarm. The term cases is a curious newspeak calculation and a departure from death rate as the proxy for viral veracity. Under this new numbers game, cases justified the lockdowns and provided ample opportunity for the mainstream media to fan the flames of fear. Case statistics soared through the roof to match the earlier discredited projections. After all, closures were extended and police were pursuing measures avoiders. Governments took an active role in calling for increased testing, which, in a PCR-based false positive-laden reality, created another positive reinforcing loop. The more you test, the more positives you will necessarily generate, regardless of the potency of any underlying virus. Unfortunately, as a matter of calculation, if one wanted to shut down a certain region at a certain time, say to cancel Christmas in Timbuktu, one would simply increase the testing in Timbuktu during the week leading up to the target date. Green zones will naturally turn yellow, and yellow zones will naturally turn red, and away we go. The tactical measures for health or something else. Hospitals were remunerated on the number of COVID cases and any opportunity to plug in a ventilator. Cause of death data logging reverted to COVID pretty well across the board. We were no longer permitted to die from anything else. Traditional tried and proven coronavirus medications such as hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin were discredited early in the pandemic through swiftly minted central studies, resulting in normal therapies being pulled from the shelf. The elderly were alienated, their care regimes were altered or curtailed, their support staff were overworked, the death rate increased accordingly. Now, nothing in the foregoing has suggested there may not have been a virus. In fact, I know personally of a few cases that would warrant further investigation. The key question is more one of timing. How did this develop, and is the wizard benefiting? Part 2, to engineer or not to engineer. As we learned on the silver screen in 1939, there is no wizard, but there may well be a man behind the curtain. Thus, if there is a conspiracy, only very terrestrial beings could be engineering from behind the curtain. Here we will address what is engineering, how can we detect engineering, the practicality of coincidence, tactic over principle, and voices of science. What is engineering? Engineering is the opposite of nature. Here is my AOAI homebrewed definition of engineering. The application of science to shape the direction of something that would not naturally occur. Engineering structures against natural entropy or randomness to enable the planning, development, and delivery of an intended outcome. As this wasn't lifted out of a dictionary, I welcome any challenges to this definition. So basically, in this section, we are trying to discern between COVID from nature versus COVID by design. How can we detect engineering? Well, generally, at interstitial points in an engineering development, one can reverse engineer the steps to reconstitute the higher baselines. And peering back far enough, the semblance of an originating design or plan. Of course, in any enterprise engaging in engineering, there would be formative terms of reference that set out the intended outcome. The practicality of coincidence. Analysis in the higher protocol seeks to consider whether modeling the environment beyond the fishbowl can better explain causation. Part of this modeling is consideration of the flow of benefit to certain parties and any goodness of fit with other plans or objectives. Should a pattern or untenable coincidence be observed, further analysis would be required to consider whether there might be an unnatural guiding hand, or in this case, a potential purpose for having a virus. Further analysis is also required to determine whether the benefiting entities are as they represent on their public post office box, and do they perhaps converge on a common post office box. However, some of this notion of a pattern comes down to taste. How many parameters falling into place to consistently benefit the same party would you accept before launching an investigation of engineering? If, for example, you were to flip a coin, how many consecutive heads would you tolerate before declaring the game fixed? There can be no objective science-based answer to this. It's a matter of personal taste. Whether or not a theory is proven, one could also evaluate whether the model is predictive. If we discover an alleged underlying plan and simply reading from the next steps in that plan correlates with what transpires, you have either discovered engineering or a hell of a coincidence. Tactic over principle. Here we will consider the moral position of unfolding events. The general public are operating under the presumption that someone is looking out for them, and that for COVID, the intent of this someone is to return them to normal as soon as practical. They thus trust that this someone is on a principled footing and would not be tactically manipulating to gain the upper hand or manipulating to smuggle in a plan or anything. In an earlier video, we addressed the dynamic baseline model as a 5-level taxonomy based on the reduction of political values to ideological principles, to strategic objectives, to tactical methods, to regulatory rules, with the suggestion that for any healthy society or institution, these should be aligned. If, on the other hand, someone were to break with principle, to short circuit to whatever they can get away with, the larger system will, in the fullness of time, weed this out. People will eventually not stand for it, but it does take time. Time, that precious commodity that we seem to have very little of right now. The moral questions for COVID are: do the response tactics appear as properly motivated, measured, balanced, and proportionate? Do the waves and variants appear to be consistent with nature, or are they timed for optimization of the plan? Is the public's interest in the protection from a virus balanced with protection of other considerations within the portfolio of your prosperity, safety, and security interests? Further surfacing the principle of democracy, is the public being consulted in the formulation of its destiny? Are the fish provided adequate tools to peer beyond the fishbowl? Might there be any signs of a larger agenda being pieced together under the guise of COVID? Under today's system, there is no time to think. Debate on the program's orientation is forbidden. How do we ensure against tactical manipulation? Well, on this matter of principle, we should reflect on the late Prince Philip's remark many decades ago: in the event that I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus to contribute something to solving overpopulation. Here it would seem the higher-ups have greater preoccupations than the average fish would be hoisting aboard. How could this concern for overpopulation manifest in terms of a plan? How does this align with public trust? Given that business liabilities have been removed and medical testing regimes have canceled the otherwise required decades-long period of observation, what are the implications for your health over the long term? Voices of science. So who are the voices of science that are leading us forward? They seem to be the cornerstone of our leadership's justifications. How can these voices of science be the voices of science where other voices of science don't agree with the voices of science? Inherent to science is falsifiability, transparency, preoccupation with alternative perspectives, and an ultimate satisfaction with maintaining uncertainty. So as a matter of science alone, voices of science cannot be definitive and can't be of science. Might we perhaps be conflating the term science with politics of science, or the science of politics, and voices of science with voices of the science politic, or perhaps voices of political science? In a world where certain voices of science will be arrested to ensure other voices of science will prevail, I'm not sure that this constitutes objective science. Should we perhaps add that modifier for greater certainty? As our politicians are punting to the voices of science and the voices of science are promoting their politics, an old engineering term developed for this sort of logical predicament comes to mind. The term is bullshit. Apart from noting a perception that the supported brand of scientists might be unwittingly drafted into selling a program, we should also anticipate that absent responsibility for the economy and other dimensions critical to our well-being, stop everything and lock down should be the anticipated verdict. That is, until someone removes decision authority from science. Part 3, the Protocol 4 position. Here, COVID is simply the latest tool in the arsenal of deployed covert weapons designed to surrender sovereign liberties to the center under their New World Order. Although we could debate the merit in justifying a New World Order, it will one day seem inevitable. The purpose of this presentation is simply to distinguish between analytic truth and manipulation. What are viewed as COVID measures in Protocol 1 are at Protocol 4 COVID objectives. Thus, in this alternative universe, the dreaded lockdowns, small business closures, debt accumulation, and continuous vaccination regimes are the objective, and this puts your health on the line. As an analytic certainty, we should consider the representations of the Protocol 1 official narratives endorsed by your learned institutions on the preceding 5 events have all been patently false. This leaves us at a crossroads to choose between popular stories or truth. From a Protocol 4 perspective, one of the greatest consternations with Protocol 1ers is the myopic focus on a pandemic to the exclusion of other greater and balancing considerations. In contrast to the larger protocols, these events are viewed within the context of the Center's broader suite of programs currently in play that, as they begin to converge, form part of the FAIR context and modeling cause and effect. Here we will address starting the clock, prepositioning, democracy, gravity, and black holes, collateral programs, and in search of a wizard. Starting the clock. Now at Protocol 4, the clock started before the clock started. We need to unpack this. I thought you said things started in 2020. There were some noteworthy precursor activities that may add noteworthy context to current events. Firstly, George Herbert Walker Bush spearheaded Agenda 21 back in 1992, where the future plan for the New World Order in the 21st century was signed into being by 178 countries. While many of us wondered at the time what he, as President of the United States, was preoccupied by, at Protocol 4, the challenge for the higher-ups he was reporting to would be, how does one cause the public to drop what they have and simply walk into the light to own nothing? The program was updated to Agenda 2030, signed in 2015 by 193 countries, this time leaving a mere 15 years for a significant global transformation, and thus the need for people now to start running into the light. We then had the World Economic Forum out of Davos, attended by the world's elite, to plan for the end of capitalism. That is, for other than those in attendance. This is where the expressions Build Back Better and Green New Deal, parroted over and over in their speeches and now entrenched in domestic legislative infrastructure, have flown past sustainability to be installed in your legislation. There were, of course, trials and testing of vaccination and wellness passports in Africa and in India in preparation for COVID philanthropist Gates Event 201 held in October 2019. Providing the opportunity to engage selected voices of science on a training run for a hypothetical pandemic. Thankfully, fact-checking has determined there is no correlation between philanthropist Gates' ambitions at the time and the pandemic that thereupon went live. We have already, of course, expunged liability for business risks for companies manufacturing experimental drugs to accelerate the solution for the disease we hadn't yet encountered. This, of course, doesn't diminish risk, it merely transfers it to you. Meanwhile, the guy we are not permitted to talk about, that was at the center of the WF, was out meeting with your leaders for social engagements or perhaps something else. Prepositioning. It's funny how the same players seem to remain ahead of the power curve, from Rothschilds to Rockefellers to Gates to Clintons. Those same familiar faces know where to be at the right time. How did they have the foresight to invest in the disease, the one they had been advertising, when their return on investment would be contingent on nature bringing forward the required and timely disaster? How did nature find out about Agenda 2030 and its timelines? Democracy, gravity, and black holes. Gravity is an invisible acceleration due to mass. A heavy mass bends the fabric of space-time, causing an attraction to the center of the mass. Gravity is proportionate to the extent of mass. With enough mass, gravity approaches absolute. Say with a black hole, for example, where control from the center dominates mobility within the universe, where even light cannot escape its grasp, which is why observers here call it a black hole. The key takeaway here is it is invisible. So my question is, what gravity is posed by the invisible, wealthy, and all-empowered global elites at the center of the economic universe? They are a formidable force in our social and financial affairs. While remaining relatively incognito, they have been a major influence in our governments, our institutions, including our mainstream media, our academia, and our social media. They warp the fabric of objective analysis to install their benefit and have been doing this throughout our institution's history. The institutions revert from objective analysis to install today's etiquette of right-think, and we all follow the yellow brick road. What are the chances that the center power base would leave world affairs to the free will of the people and their leaders to fair and open elections? In warped space, is there any chance that your elections are really a choice between pre-selections? What reward or extortable power might the center have over your leader? In warp space, is your leader yours? May I be bold enough to go on to ask today, what is the escape velocity of a permitted human thought? Collateral programs. So at Protocol 4, the Great Reset, Agenda 2030, and the end of world poverty, equalization under the BLM and Antifa programs, and the natural impact of COVID business shutdowns are part of the theater of the absurd that forms a pattern of building greater mass for the center that is planned to culminate with the ensuing IMF-backed digital currency. There will be debt forgiveness for all, provided you sign away your right to own capital. Under the slogan repeated by your leaders, you will own nothing and you will be happy. It would appear that they are certainly right on the first part of that. And we should anticipate ahead the climate lockdowns, the anticipated COVID-21 or Delta variant and its waves and variants, a further generous application of carbon and equity taxes, and once we are chipped, the mobility control grid managed through the 5G network that is, at this point, being quickly built up around you. In search of a wizard. Bringing our friend philanthropist Gates back into the discussion, at Protocol 4, there's a striking similarity between those successive Windows updates as experienced for decades during his tenure as head of Microsoft, where frequent updates would arrive to maintain the currency and thus the utility of your computer. Without them, you are finished. And today, through the Wellness Passport, we have the opportunity for frequent fax updates to maintain your currency and utility as a member of society, and without them, you are finished. But the control resides well above that. Let's have a look at your leaders and follow the strings upward to uncover the puppeteers of the City of London, the WF, and the UN. Then follow the strings upward to uncover the largest power structures in the world through the millennia, the Vatican and the Crown. Now, none of this proves an operating Protocol 4. However, it does seem to uncover a model that provides that basis for prediction of your future. To reinforce some impracticality in Protocol 4, let's run through the 10-step playbook of global social engineering. Part 4, Engineering a Global Transformation. If a wizard were to plan a transformation from on high, a grand design, what would that look like? The challenge that gave rise to the need for a global transformation is the center's realization that the public cannot be left to manage itself. Democracy is not a sufficient tool to set a sustaining course for humanity. The general public, that moral majority, have very limited insight or inclination to probe into the larger issues, and thus there is limited utility in an objective democracy. Would you honestly leave fish to manage themselves? Here we will address the following 10 steps from the Masonic Playbook.
Step 1.
Initiate the various individual components to be assembled. Each of the sub-assembly components to the final resolution are to be initiated separately to avoid the outcome prematurely appearing to the masses as a coherent mosaic. Climate change, pandemic, end of poverty, equalization, BLM and Antifa, Build Back Better, Green New Deal, carbon tax, debt expansion, U.S. election foibles, universal income, the Great Reset, gender neutrality, the end of capitalism, are all to remain as disparate and discrete tasks until we approach final assembly.
Step 2.
Cloak the objective in philanthropic doublespeak. It is important that the initiative be interpretable as benevolence for plausible public acceptability. Its sources, such as the Rockefeller Institute, must be portrayed as philanthropists. Advertising their good intentions will cloak the initiative in honor, thereby keeping preoccupied fish from bothering to peek above the waterline.
Step 3.
Telegraph the unassembled components to the masses in advance. While observing points 1 and 2, telegraph to the public the individual components to the plan. The public won't have the context to piece things together, and this will be eventually important to reassuring the masses we knew this all along. Through the rollout, the greater picture can only be uncovered as and when the masses are ready to receive it.
Step 4.
Engineer the reward systems for advocacy and supporting gravity. The plan will require alignment and recruitment of many players critical to its formulation, such as politicians, voices of science, mainstream media, social media, businesses, the courts. The trick is to set up the dominoes so that the center's effort is merely to slant the first piece in the right direction. Use the public's innate lust for money to establish a self-guiding gravity for policy installation.
Step 5.
Secure ownership of elected officials. Domestic democracy is only a problem where leaders support their public ahead of the center's intentions. The model must revert to a leader foremostly aligning with the center, to know where their bread is buttered, so to speak, and secondarily, to act as the facilitator to sell the center's wares. The Club of Rome will vet any would-be leadership hopefuls for intentions in this regard and must ensure extortable dirt to further allegiance. Leaders openly displaying support for the center, like wearing a mask, will be rewarded through favorable treatment in the media. Conversely, leaders not demonstrating allegiance will be character assassinated in the media. Leadership in the countries of significant power, as with the United States, for example, can't be left to the whims of democracy. Where the foregoing approach fails, we have Dominion voting machines and ultimately the JFK solution as required.
Step 6.
Own the message. Jargonize the critical tools such as Build Back Better, Green New Deal, the Great Reset. Each of these feature the positive doublespeak. Each is parroted by the country's leaders. Biden, Trudeau just love to say these sound bites while wearing masks. Use the mainstream media to further propagate and reinforce the themes through the incessant repetition. Also use the mainstream media to demonize those who think beyond the program.
Step 7.
Instigate a false flag. Optional. It is important to select an event that will galvanize the will of the people to respond in support of the program. Choose an event where the center sufficiently controls the parameters, where public fear will be maximized, where the remedy naturally shifts public desires in the intended direction. Position the false flag with a plausible bad guy like Wuhan, China.
Step 8.
Divide and conquer. Seek to divide the public. Promote the Protocol 1 majority as the guardians of right think. Rely on the Protocol 1ers to police any critical thinking by others. Instill emblems of allegiance such as buttons, badges, and masks. Have the public wear them everywhere. Create Greta Thunberg-type testimonials. Use the elected leaders to personally demonstrate the benefit of adherence to the plan.
Step 9.
Transform very slowly. As with boiling frogs, it is essential that the public be brought forward gradually, instilling a light at the end of the tunnel that perpetually leads to another light at the end of another tunnel. This is an effective way to migrate the public mind from the unthinkable to slow, steady, and willing compliance.
Step 10.
Tie in the legal infrastructure. Ensure leaders bring forward interstitial legislative change to lock public flexibility to the new gravity, to prevent any rebounding to the will of the people. Part 5, the conclusion. In comparing Protocol 1 to Protocol 4, it seems to me the Protocol 1ers are navigating to their emotions of trust and faith and are unable to reason on a sound analytic footing. And when discussions reach beyond the familiar fishbowl, the anxiety increases. For those in Protocol 1 willing to critically think, a concept that does not come naturally to fish, we can test some of the rudiments of current events to see if actions appear to be centered on protecting your health, or do they appear to divert towards something more akin to installing a program. Tactics that sideswipe any interest in health in the process. This is the crux of the debate, really. Are measures authentic or synthetic? Are the risks assessed, weighed, and factored into our decisions? Have leadership ambitions somehow myopically focused on the next step in the program, and do they appear to marshal forward to that end with intransigence and to the detriment of your current circumstance? Are you able to criticize the system per both your democratic right and your obligation? Is anyone really intending to return you to normal? Are the trusted officials to be trusted? Might they be a controlled substance? In parallel, consider, are the 6 major events addressed in the last video a testament to our ability to institutionally avoid conspiracy, or is it, as Protocol 4 suggests, evidence of an expanding institutional delusion? Are there any common themes in the respective remedial actions? Given that the Center committed itself to installing Agenda 21 and subsequently Agenda 2030, and they approached the public suggesting we were to convert to socialism with universal income in lieu of pension obligations, a metered digital currency, removal of capital ownership, a mobility control framework, reduction to central supply chains, a change to the food supply, equity and carbon taxes to enable land confiscation and depopulation. Is everyone okay with that? I think we know what the masses would have replied. So instead, structured issues and events cajole the public into conformance, and it appears to be working. They achieve through the back door what would not be accepted through the front. Protocol 1 has been a nice haven for fish to grow up in. However, the irreversible impacts to society may be mounting. For better or for worse, we are quite obviously changing the course of humanity on a mass scale. Maybe it's time to stop being a fish. Should we be walking into the light under duress under the notion that there is no time to think? With depopulation in the cards, this may well be the greatest analytic poker game humanity has ever played. I'm in. How about you? I'm Mark Seeley, and on behalf of Dan Carrier, thanks very much for watching. Until next time.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
That's why today I am committing the United States to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And as long as I am president, and well after I'm done being president, I will keep fighting for the education and housing and healthcare and jobs that reduce inequality and create opportunity here in the United States and around the world.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this.
The world is in a state of emergency.
This is going to require a national response.